Hello and welcome to Biblical Breadcrumbs, where we're in 1 Samuel chapter 25. A fool, his wife, and an outcast walk out into a desert, or rather they meet in a desert, and you start to ask some questions. Who is good? Who is bad? And who is going to be godly? Well, you get three main characters in this story, and one of them is pretty terrible, one of them is pretty great, and one of them is kind of middling, and it's to his credit that he ultimately comes around in the end, but still, there is a bit of a conflicted character in the middle. We have three people in 1 Samuel 25. If you're familiar with the text, it's a story about a man named Nabal, a rich fool, as he's often termed. He is the bad guy. You have Abigail, his wife, who is actually fantastic, and everything she does seems to be pretty great. And then you have David, who has some good things that he does, and he also has some bad things that he does, and it's a little bit more complicated when you get down to him. Question for today is a very simple question. What kind of person do you want to be? What attitudes should you imitate as you're going through? And who should your role model be if you're looking at these three people, for example? 1 Samuel chapter 25. That's where we are today. I'm going to go ahead and read the whole chapter. It is a little bit long. That's the wrong chapter end. It is, it's about 40, we'll read down through verse 38. I should probably note that on my notes. For some reason, that's not written down. We'll read down through verse 38 because that's going to be, that's enough for the story to get those points across. 1 Samuel 25, starting in verse 1. Then Samuel died, and all Israel assembled and mourned for him, and they buried him at his house in Ramah. And David set out and went down to the wilderness of Paran. Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel, and the man was very rich, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And it came about, while he was shearing his sheep in Carmel, now the man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail, and the woman was intelligent and beautiful in appearance, but the man was harsh and evil in his dealings, and he was a Calebite, that David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel and visit Nabal and greet him in my name, and this is what you shall say. Have a long life, peace to you, and peace to your house, and peace to all that you have. Now then, I have heard that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us. We have not harmed them, nor has anything of theirs gone missing all the days they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we have come on a festive day. Please give whatever you find at hand to your servants and to your son David." When David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal in accordance with all these words in David's name. Then they waited. But Nabal answered David's servants and said, "Who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are each breaking away from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I have slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men whose origin I do not know?" So David's young men made their way back and returned, and they came and informed them in accordance with all these words. Then David said to his men, "Each of you strap on a sword." So each man strapped on a sword, and David also strapped on his sword. And about 400 men went up with David, while 200 stayed with the baggage. Now one of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, "Behold, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he spoke to them in anger. Yet the men were very good to us, and we were not harmed, nor did anything go missing as long as we went with them while we were in the fields. They were a wall to us, both by day and by night, all the time we were with them tending the sheep. Now then be aware and consider what you should do, because harm is plotted against our master and against all his household, and he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him." Verse 18. Then Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves of bread and 2 jugs of wine, and 5 sheep already prepared, and 5 measures of roasted grain, and 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs, and she loaded them on donkeys. Then she said to her young men, "Go on after me. Behold, I am coming after you." But she did not tell her husband, Nabal. And it happened, as she was riding on her donkey and coming down by the hidden part of the mountain, that behold, David and his men were coming down toward her, so she met them. Now David had said, "It is certainly for nothing that I have guarded everything that this man has in the wilderness, so that nothing has gone missing of all that belonged to him, for he has returned me evil for good. May God do so to the enemies of David, and much more so, if by morning I leave alive as much as one male of any who belong to him." When Abigail saw David, she hurried and dismounted from her donkey, and fell on her face in front of David, and bowed herself to the ground. She fell at his feet, and said, "On me alone, my lord, be the blame. And please let your slave speak to you, and listen to the words of your slave. Please do not let my lord pay attention to this worthless man Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and stupidity is with him. But I, your slave, did not see the young men of my lord whom you sent. Now then, my lord, as the Lord lives, and as your soul lives, since the Lord has restrained you from shedding blood, and from avenging yourself by your own hand, now then may your enemies and those who seek evil against my lord be like Nabal. And now let this gift which your servant has brought to my lord be given to the young men who accompany my lord. Please forgive the offense of your slave, for the Lord will certainly make for my lord an enduring house, because my lord is fighting the battles of the Lord, and evil will not be found in you all your days. Should anyone rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, then the life of my lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will sling out as with the hollows of a sling. And when the Lord does for my lord, in accordance with all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and appoints you ruler over Israel, this will not become an obstacle to you, or a troubled heart to my lord, both by having shed blood without cause, and by my lord's having avenged himself. When the Lord deals well with my lord, then remember your slave." Verse 32, Then David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, who sent you this day to meet me, and blessed be your discernment, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from bloodshed, and from avenging myself by my own hand. Nevertheless, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, there certainly would not have been left to Nabal until the morning light as much as one male." So David accepted from her hand what she had brought him, and he said to her, "Go up to your house in peace. See, I have listened to you and granted your request." And then Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was having a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was cheerful within him, for he was very drunk, so she didn't tell him anything at all until the morning light. But in the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things, and his heart died within him, so that he became like a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. The rest of the chapter is Abigail going back to David. Ultimately, David takes Abigail for his own wife, just to take care of her and provide for her. And there's a little bit of a fight at the end, or there's a little bit of a contention about some of David's other wives in verses 43 and 44. Not saying that David having multiple wives is good. Actually, it's pretty bad, and it's kind of a mark against his character, but that is beyond the scope of this sermon. What you have here is a picture of three different people: Nabal, Abigail, and David, all of them representative of different facets of humanity, different kinds of struggles or strengths that you have in different human beings. And ultimately, you have one guy who's basically just rotten all the way through, who's Nabal. You have one lady who's basically righteous all the way through. Her name is Abigail. And you have David, who is kind of an interesting mix of the two. He is not entirely righteous. He has struggles. He has problems. And yet, he also comes around to the good in the end, which is at least better than Nabal is. And so you have those kinds of balances. You have to ask yourself the question, who do I want to be like? Do I want to be like Nabal, who's rotten to the core, Abigail, righteous to the core, or David, who struggles and ends up righteous, but it would just be better if he had been righteous the whole time? Which one do I want to be? Like, where do you want to end up? It's a very simple sermon, but maybe, hopefully, it stands as a good reminder. We start here with Nabal. We'll discuss this not by, chronological sequence, but we'll discuss this basically by character. Nabal, then Abigail, and then we'll get to David, point 1, point 2, ultimately point 3. All of these sections start out by defining the individual's name. Nabal is a name that means fool, especially as you see it in verse 25, I think it is. Abigail, when she comes out and talks about Nabal, she says, "As his name is, so is he." Nabal is his name, and stupidity is with him. It was his name, it meant fool, and he is a fool. Now, it is unclear whether Nabal was a name that meant fool, and he was named at birth. His parents basically named him an idiot at birth, and that's what he grew up into. It's unclear also, maybe Nabal was what people called him, Nabal being a term meaning fool. It may be that his name is actually like John or something, but people call him Nabal, the fool. The third option is he is so terrible and he is so foolish that Nabal used to mean something perfectly fine and normal, or maybe it didn't really have a meaning, but because of how stupid this guy was, people started referring to him as like, oh, that's Nabal, and Nabal started to get a bad reputation. The name Jezebel kind of has this. It's not necessarily a horrible name by itself, but because of its reputation with the Jezebel we all know and hate, nobody really names their kid Jezebel anymore because of the connotation. It may be that Nabal was a name that didn't mean anything until Nabal took it, at which point everybody started realizing, no, we kind of hate this guy. This guy is awful. Regardless, at any rate, and whatever his name originally meant, he has a less than good reputation. He is the fool by definition. And so you start to ask, well, why is that? What are some defining character traits of Nabal? What are some things that make people hate us and maybe even make God displeased with us as well? Well, here are some things that he's known for. Here are some things that he's good at. He is the fool. How is he the fool? Because he is, number one, he is greedy. You can see it in verse 2. You can see it in verse 11. You can see it in verse 37 as well. Verse 2, he's very rich, 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. He has quite a lot of property, and yet when he's asked to share some of it, he says in verse 11, this is my bread, my water, my meat that are slaughtered for my shearers, and am I supposed to just give them away? Brother, if you have 3,000 sheep, you can spare a few sheep. And yet, this man does not. 3,000 is quite a lot, but you can't even spare one and give it to David for some kind of food and sustenance. It's striking to me that in verse 37, when he is ultimately, when Nabal enters into the realm of death, whatever this exactly looks like, in verse 37, his heart dies within him and he becomes like a stone. And then in verse 38, he is struck and died. I don't know if God struck him and caused his heart to die within him, and then later on he died. I don't know if this is he went into a coma for a while and then he died. This may be that God has, or that he was just so disheartened at having lost some food, or he was so, or whatever it was, that he ended up having a bit of a panic attack or a heart attack and then ended up dying from it. But regardless, it's all caused by his wife telling him these things in verse 37. I think it's caused by her telling him that she gave David some of his stuff. It seems that he has so much that he is not willing to lose any of it. And when he does lose some of it, when somebody else gives it away on his behalf, it strikes him to such an extent that he dies. Unfortunately, he did not learn the term or the terms of the agreement. To whom much has been given, much is required. He was given much. He had a ton, and yet he wasn't willing to share it. If you are greedy, that is part of being a fool. Don't be greedy. It's not going to end well for you. A second point on Nabal's character is the idea of his arrogance. You see arrogance in verses 10 and 13 especially. Nabal answers, David sends servants to Nabal and they say, hey, could you provide a little bit for us? Nabal says no to David's servants in verse 10. Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are each breaking away from his master. He asks this question, who is David? And if you are naive and nice and willing to give the benefit of the doubt to everyone, you may read that and say, maybe he just doesn't know who David is. Unfortunately, I would disagree with that reading. In verse 10, there are many servants today who are breaking away from his master. What is he talking about? Well, he's presumably referring to David's history because he knows the things that David has done. Saul, if you remember, David is on the run from Saul right now because Saul has decided to go and murder David. He's trying to hunt David down. David's on the run. And it may well be that Nabal is afraid of Saul's wrath, like you see in chapter 22 when Saul goes in and butchers all the priests in the temple, or in the tabernacle at this point, the priests who had helped David. Saul just kind of butchers them and gets rid of them. It may be that Nabal is afraid of that kind of punishment, but he asks this question, and then he asserts, you're just another slave running away from his master. He knows who David is. And that means he presumably also knows what David has done. David has just sent servants to tell him what he's done. In verse 7, I've got these people all around, and, we've been hanging around your shepherds. We haven't hurt them at all. We had perfect capacity to. We're very, very armed and capable, but we haven't hurt you guys. Can we have something in return? Nabal is very aware of this. In verse 15, 16, 17, the servant of Nabal goes to Abigail, Nabal's wife, and says, look, these guys were in the field. They could have killed us, but they didn't. They kept us alive. They protected us, actually, from all these horrible things. It means that they are very capable, and yet, instead of acknowledging that David could theoretically do some harm to him and, agreeing to be a blessing and help David, he just asks, who is David? He probably knows that David has a small army with him of 600 men, and yet decides to taunt the guy anyway. Arrogance is not the trait of wisdom. It's the trait of the Nabal. The third thing you see in Nabal is his ingratitude. Already touched upon in verses 7 and 8, and then in verses 15 and 16, David protected his flock, but Nabal will not pay him or reward him for his defense. Actually, Nabal goes beyond that. It's not just that there is a refusal to give thanks or a refusal to appreciate what David did, but there is outright hostility towards him. Why should we listen to you? I'm not going to give you anything. I don't know who you are, in verse 11. The men whose origin I do not know. He knows David. He knows David is the son of Jesse. He knows David was the servant of Saul who's on the run, all according to verse 10. Yes, he does know the origin of these people, but he's not willing to give them anything. Ungrateful. You see, ingratitude is part of being a Nabal. Don't be a fool. Greed, arrogance, and ingratitude. Fourth, you see unkindness. Verses 10 and 11. It would be one thing to say, look, I appreciate your help. I see what you've done here, and I appreciate that you didn't take advantage of your strength, but I'm not really able to give you anything. Or it's another thing to say, look, I appreciate that, but I didn't factor that in. I didn't factor paying you in, and so I was supposed to get this amount of profit, and my margins are really slim, and so if I actually give you something, then I'll lose money on this, and I really can't afford to do that. Those things may not have been true in Nabal's case. I don't know the exact circumstances, but it's one thing to reject someone like that and give actual reasons for why you're doing it. Nabal, instead, goes out of the way to be offensive. You are David, the son of Jesse? I don't know who you are. Nobody cares where you come from. We don't know your origin. I know your father. I know your place of birth. I know your past. I know your history. I know your previous employer, Saul. I know all these things about you, but I don't actually know anything about you. And Nabal tries to shove that off as some kind of you seem like a suspect individual, even though David has proven himself over and over and over again that he is very honorable. He's not going to take these things by force, even though he could. He's not going to do this violent stuff, even though he's perfectly able to. Hey, we would rather just ask for it. We would rather be nice. We would rather be honest. We would rather be above board and God-honoring, and we don't want anything bad to happen to you, right? We don't want to do that to you. But Nabal answers him in just a straight-up unkind way. It's not enough for Nabal to say, no, I'm sorry, I had not factored in paying you, and I wasn't really planning to do that. I'm not going to. It's another thing for Nabal to say, I just don't know who you are, and I don't care, and you don't matter. That's just not very nice. That's the kind of attitude that goes along with being a Nabal. A fifth thing that you see, greedy, arrogant, ungrateful, unkind, unreasonable, you see, and drunk. Two references to this, verses 17 and 36. Verse 17, the servant is speaking to Abigail, again, Abigail, Nabal's wife, and says, look, harm is plotted against our master and against all his household, and he is such a worthless man, no one can speak to him. Which means I can't reason with him. And then you drop down a little bit later on. In verse 36, Abigail comes in, and Nabal is very drunk, so she doesn't tell him anything. He's not reasonable. He's not able to be reasoned with. by order of drunkenness, right? He is drunken in that instance, but I think the verse 17 was just kind of said in general. He is unreasonable. He's not someone you can talk with and make a deal with. He's not someone who's going to be humble. He's not someone who's going to be helpful. He's just basically a sack of trash. I mean, that's the nicest way to say it. And there's nothing redeemable about someone like this. Everyone knows he cannot be reasoned with. Everyone knows there's not even a point to even try. Everyone knows this. He has a reputation, and it's not only that he is bad, but he has the reputation of never being able to change. Because change requires acknowledging that there's a problem, and Nabal just won't do it. Welcome to what it means to be a fool, a Nabal of sorts. Greedy, arrogant, ungrateful, unkind, unreasonable, and also a drunkard. Now, you can try and make excuses for Nabal if you're inclined to. You can say in chapter 22, Saul's wrath did decimate a lot of people. Yes, it is a dangerous game to get in the middle of King Saul and his prey, David. It is a dangerous thing, and so it's understandable. It would even be understandable for Nabal to say, look, I appreciate that. Like, I appreciate that you've helped me. However, you are on the run from King Saul, and I don't want to incur the wrath of King Saul. It is one thing for Nabal to give that as the explanation for why he cannot help David. But instead he insults David, he insults David's lineage, he insults his importance, he demeans him, he mocks him, he's irritated at him, he just makes fun of him, he ignores his complaint, he ignores his plight, he ignores the help that David rendered, and he's just all around an awful person. Do you really want to be someone like Nabal, the fool? Proverbs makes a big deal about the righteous versus the fool. The righteous one does all these things, the fool does these things. And sometimes there's a tendency to say, I do one foolish thing every now and then, but it's not that bad. Okay, but that means you are the fool, right? If you do something foolish, that means you're playing into the fool. That means you're playing into the Nabal of it all. That means you're being like him. That means you're not going down a good path. Don't be like Nabal. There's no value or benefit in doing so. Wise versus fool, which one are you? Well, Nabal is depressing for all those reasons, but then you switch to the page over and suddenly you start looking at character number 2. Her name is Abigail. Abigail is contrastedly quite incredible. In every way that Nabal is awful and horrible, Abigail is just so much better in every comparable way. They say opposites attract. I don't even know that that's true a lot of the time. Sometimes it's true, sure. A lot of the time it's not true. But in this case, it definitely is true, or at least opposites get married, because it doesn't seem like Abigail's that attracted to Nabal. I would not, he's a fool, right? He's got all these terrible things. He's not really attracting anyone other than how much money and wealth that he actually has. Abigail, instead of Nabal is named fool. Whether he contributed to that or not, I have no idea. He is named fool. Abigail is named, on the other hand, the source of joy. And that's something interesting. I have no idea how she got saddled with this loser. I was not in charge. Presumably something happened with arranged marriage / she chose, people choose wealth and financial stability over love sometimes, so it could be something like that, but this is basically the very definition of a guy who is marrying out of his league. By the way, happy Mother's Day yesterday, whenever this video releases. This is the Mother's Day sermon. The reason I'm preaching on 1 Samuel 25 is because it's the standout passage of the week that has to do with a woman in it. And that's the closest you're going to get from me in terms of a Mother's Day, a traditional Mother's Day sermon. Abigail is the source of joy. That's what her name means. And as such, what joy is she giving out? Well, all sorts of different things. Nabal was greedy, but Abigail is generous. Look at verse 18 for the contrast. When Nabal is given the chance to help David, and he says, absolutely not, you can have nothing. Abigail, when she's given the chance to help David, her reason took I can't even speak, hurried and took 200 loaves of bread and 2 jugs of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 500 measures of roasted grain and 100 cakes of raisins and 200 cakes of figs and loaded them on donkeys and took them out to David. Nabal refused to give absolutely anything. Abigail comes back around and gives quite a lot, actually. Now, David does have 600 people, so I'm not sure exactly how many meals this would equate to, but 200 loaves of bread is a decent amount of bread. I mean, the food that she's giving them is actually pretty providing for them fairly decently. It is a sacrifice. And Abigail, when she talks about it to Nabal, it may well be that Nabal would have reacted horribly if it had been 2 loaves of bread, much less 200. But the fact is, for it to give Nabal seemingly like a heart attack as it does, this does seem to be a decent chunk of food. It's something that they could well afford. They were a wealthy family, but it is still a sacrifice and a blessing to others. Instead of being greedy, Abigail is generous. That's the kind of thing that you should be looking for. That's what people who are sources of joy give out, as opposed to the greed which ensnares the fool. Nabal is arrogant. He brags about how he's greater than David. Who is David? He knows who David is, but he doesn't care. He's mocking him and making fun of him, even though he knows David has a hostile army on the door. Abigail, when she comes out to David in verse 23, when she comes down to David, she gets off the donkey and bows down to him as a sign of respect and honor. This is not something that is done in a hateful manner, although she would be well within her rights to do so. Abigail, as a person, David is actively coming in with 400 armed men to come and slaughter at least every male in the house, if not just kind of everybody that's there. Abigail could come to David in an incensed or righteous indignation kind of attitude and yell at David for how evil he's being and yell at David for the foolish choice he's making and give him food in a spiteful way that is, hey, we're paying you, now get out of here. But she doesn't choose to do so. Instead, when she approaches David, she bows down in front of him, and she starts to plead with him. She uses a lot of honorifics. She says Lord a lot. In fact, it's kind of difficult to parse exactly what is being said. She uses the Lord to talk about God. She also uses my Lord to talk about David, it seems like. And so there's just kind of this effusive praise and just kind of a willingness to admit, hey, David, you're pretty great. Like, you're incredible. I'm sorry we offended you. Instead of trying to rag on David for the bad choice that he is making. David is making a foolish choice here. We'll come back around to it in the David section. But it should be said, Abigail is here to kind of assuage the situation and make sure that everything is going to go okay. I'm sorry we offended you. I'm sorry we didn't give you things. Here you go. Here's how it's going to be. This is what I can provide for you. All done in a humble manner instead of an arrogant or a hateful one. All done admitting her own fault instead of mocking David and pushing him and irritating him and pushing him up to the brink. This is all done in a peacemaking manner. While Nabal sees what David has done for him and says, that doesn't actually count for anything. And it's very kind of offensive, definitely ungrateful. Abigail turns it around and uses her abilities as a peacemaker. She could do this kind of like nice actions where she gives him food, but again, use improper words like, here you go, you hateful man, or whatever like that. You are coming and trying to murder our family. Here's your bribe. Go away. She could even say, thanks for taking care of the sheep. We really didn't need the help, but I guess thanks for it. Here's your payment. Now be gone. And she doesn't. Instead, she opens with honorifics and blessings on him. That is, verse 27, look, I am your servant. You are my Lord. I'm trying to give you a gift. Forgive the offense of your slave. Verse 28. Abigail didn't do anything wrong. She was not the one who made the decision to withhold resources from David, but she's apologizing anyway. She's just a peacemaker. God says, blessed are the peacemakers. This is kind of what is being talked about. Abigail has every right to inflame the situation more or do all the correct actions but still cause irritation at the situation, but instead she just gives all that up because she wants to resolve the situation and see an end of it, and that's all there is to it. She could do all these actions and say all the wrong words, and say a lot of fair words, but instead she's nice about it. Blessed are the peacemakers. And finally, with Abigail, what you see is her loyalty in verses 17 and 18. This is so interesting to me because Nabal is unkind, Nabal is unreasonable, and kind of tying those two together, imagine what Nabal was like as a husband. Do you really want to? He does not seem like the kind of guy who is worthwhile or a blessing or even very good. I'm not sure, it never says anything about him being abusive or anything like that, but he seems kind of like the kind of guy who might do some of that, or at least not allow his wife to say anything, or just kind of order her around like she is another slave. Nabal is the kind of guy to get his own way, to demand his own way, no matter who's in his way or no matter what the consequences would be. He just wants to do what he wants to do, and he's going to do it. On the other hand, Abigail is not that. Abigail is, verses 17 and 18, as soon as she hears that Nabal might be killed, she steps up to go in and save him and make sure he doesn't die. And that's fascinating because David's plan is to go in and kill all of the males. Think about how easy it would be for Abigail to just kind of sit back and let him kill Nabal. And everybody else too, sure, but let him kill Nabal. Or even if Abigail came to him, she could come to David and say, look, Nabal is pretty bad. What if I can give you some food? Can you go and kill Nabal for me? Can you get rid of that? The marriage covenant is until death do us part. So if somebody kills Nabal, then I guess I'm free. And that's kind of actually what happens in the end of the story. After Nabal dies, she does end up marrying David. David's a much better man than Nabal is. And yet, instead of indulging in those base kind of desires that, if I was in a marriage like that, well, there's a certain temptation to let the other person get killed to free you. Instead of indulging in the evil desires, what does Abigail do? She immediately gets her stuff and she takes it out to David and says, please go and leave us alone. With Abigail's intervention, Nabal lasts another 10 days, according to the end of the chapter, verses, or the end of our section, verses 37 and 38. 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal and he died. And so that's not great. He doesn't have a super long life after that. But without Abigail's intervention, Nabal wouldn't have had one more day. Isn't it a blessing what Abigail does, to do what's best for him, even though nothing about Nabal deserves someone being nice? Abigail comes in and she is kind and good to him anyway. Abigail is in a bad situation on multiple fronts that she's dealing with, and yet she navigates it with finesse. And she is the only one in the story to act, I would say, probably flawlessly. There's an argument to be had here that is, Abigail, she did do good for Nabal. However, she did ignore what he said. She was disobedient to her husband, and so that is kind of condemnable. And I'll grant that is a little bit questionable. However, she does do her best to keep her alive, to not only do the right thing and provide for David, not only do the kind and generous thing and provide for David, and even kind of the right thing in terms of repaying the good that David had done them, but she also is doing her best to do what's right for Nabal, even though Nabal doesn't want it. So arguably the good outweighs the bad there. You can measure that on your own. You can try and figure that like a definitive answer to that out on your own. But the point is, Abigail, for the most part, if not entirely, is completely flawless in this story. Which one do you want to be? Do you want to be like Nabal, or do you want to be like Abigail? Do you want to be the fool or the one who is the source of joy? Do you want to be the one who messes everything up, or the one who comes in and cleans up everybody else's mess? It's not a very complicated situation to choose between. When you've got one good option and one bad option, Why would you pick the bad option? Don't be greedy and arrogant and ungrateful and unkind and unreasonable, but be generous and humble and peacemaking and loyal. That's the kind of person that we all admire and that we all look up to. Great job, Abigail. Good job. You did the thing that was right. But then, of course, you come to the third character in the story. His name is David. And David is a complicated person. We know him. We know his title is the man after God's own heart. And yet, for being someone who's after God's own heart, there are an awful lot of things he does that are not very good. 1 Samuel 25 is an interesting kind of in-between in this section because some of what he does is good and righteous, and some of what he does is not. There is this there's this sway, there's this tension in between David, and I think it can be helpful for us. Not many people are as absolutely abhorrent as Nabal is. A lot of people are, there are people who are mostly bad, but even so, they will repay someone who's helped them out, right? Mostly bad, but even a little bit of good. Nabal doesn't even show a little bit of good. There are some people who are completely good and they never or very rarely do something bad. That really isn't a lot of people either. Most people are fairly messed up and kind of go back and forth. David is the much more relatable kind of, he does some good and he does some bad, and ultimately it's not that it's a wash. He does end up on the good side of things, but it is a struggle to get there. Abigail doesn't seem to have a struggle. She just does what's right. That's admirable, but a lot of us are not at that point. A lot of us are at David's point where we go back and forth and hopefully eventually get around to what's right, but we have some difficulty in getting there. David is relatable above all else, and I wish we could all relate to someone like Abigail, but instead we find ourselves sympathizing with David and his situation a lot more frequently. Spur of the moment decision based on what I just said. I am renaming this sermon. I usually just had the main title being Nabal, but that's kind of boring compared to what it's going to be named now, which is the bad, the good, and the ugly, because, may as well. David is much more the ugly. He's the kind of in-between. He is that's kind of complicated, and what exactly do I do about that? David, you start out with, and his name means beloved. Beloved. It's a great name, but it comes with some divisiveness. Beloved by whom and for what? And is that really a good thing? Oftentimes, we think it's beloved by God, and I think it especially here, it is beloved by God. God has provided for him. He's kept David alive through thick and thin and horrible situations, especially with Saul. There is a great blessing there, but as much as he is beloved by God, he's not necessarily beloved by his fellow men. Saul doesn't like him at all. Saul's trying to chase him and kill him in the desert. Nabal doesn't like him at all. Nabal is jealous or greedy, and he refuses to give anything. And Nabal is very restrictive. He's not very kind. And so you see this kind of difficulty that David has. Yes, he is beloved, but there's difficulty. And even later in this story, as you get down to verse 20, as you get down to verse 32 down through verse 35, one of the things that David says when Abigail confronts David and David repents is he says, "Blessed are you because God has used you to stop me from doing something evil." That is the mark of someone who is beloved by God, that God is stepping in and saying, hey, maybe rethink about this. Maybe be careful. Maybe don't go down the bad path. Maybe do something righteous instead. Beloved is an interesting title. It's not fully good, and yet it's nowhere near fully evil. He falls into that middle phrase where he's kind of both, and he's generally good, and he's generally trying to be good, but let's call it 70%, barely a passing grade, because boy howdy, there are a lot of things in David's life that are pretty messed up. One of the good things that you see in David's life as you dissect him, and especially as he kind of stands for dissecting any of the characters who's not just straight up good or straight up evil, you start to divide some of his character traits. You start to see some good things he does and some bad things he does, and kind of judging between those. One of the things you see in him that is good is self-control in this story. In verse 7, David, I'm in the wrong chapter. In verse 7, David sends his servants, and here's what his servants say. I've heard that you have shearers. Your shepherds have been with us. We haven't harmed them, nor has anything of theirs gone missing all the days they were in Carmel. David has 600 men who are not exactly the most morally upstanding of individuals. They are also the guys on the run from Saul. I'm sure some of them are fantastic morally and very righteous, and some of them are probably just mercenaries that he's picked up along the way, who can, sell their soul for whatever somebody's going to pay them at the moment. David is not exactly dealing with the most righteous of men, and yet he doesn't get in Nabal's way. He doesn't commandeer anything from Nabal's people. In fact, instead of taking advantage of them, they provide protective services and guard stuff from them. That is a beautiful thing. David, before the shepherds went back, David could have said, "Okay, we have blessed you, we have protected you. Go ahead and give us some of your stuff." Or David could have snuck in and stolen some stuff easily. They were in his power, and yet he doesn't. He chooses to ask instead, and he goes up to Nabal and says, "Hey, could we have some of your resources? I could have taken them from you, but I didn't. I don't want to do something like that." David shows the same kind of restraint later on with when Saul is in his power. David's able to kill Saul out in the desert, in the cave, if he wanted to, and yet David just cuts off the scrap of his robe, and even that makes him feel bad and repentant, and he says, "Look, Saul, I could have killed you, but I don't want to. I want to do what's righteous instead. Let's be above board here." He is very self-controlled. Now, if you were to jump into another story from David's life, say David and Bathsheba, you might say, okay, well, that wasn't very self-controlled. Yeah, okay, I get it. He's not perfect, right? Massive issues later on, like I've already said. But in this story, he is pretty self-controlled for the most part. At least for a little bit, because as soon as he gets some opposition, and granted, Nabal is not being nice. Nabal is being rather rude. He's being greedy and arrogant and all these things, and he's just straight up being mean. He knows who David is. He knows that David needs help. He knows that David has provided him a great service, and yet he refuses to do anything to help with it. So it's understandable that David does get angry. But nothing justifies this kind of anger. When David says, all right, he's not going to give us food, fine, let's take 400 soldiers and go and kill every male that exists in his area. Now, this is not good. This is not a good thing that David does. As much as he is self-controlled, when his self-control snaps, or when he's pushed too far, he's not self-controlled anymore. He turns straight up wrathful. Sure, Nabal is overly offensive, but David also chooses to get fired up about that instead of just moving on and going somewhere else. When Jesus comes down and says, turn the other cheek, I mean, there are a lot of implications to that passage, but the idea is, bear the insult, right? Somebody does something bad to you. Okay, don't return evil on them. Don't return evil for evil. Overcome evil with good, Paul would say over in Romans. And then you have David, who is willing to be nice, but when his enemy is unkind to him in return, well, David just goes full-on warmonger and starts to try and kill Nabal. That is not a righteous action. He's good for a moment until he's pushed too far, and then he's not good anymore. That means he has fundamental issues inside. And while it is good, and I can applaud him for being righteous for a bit, I cannot applaud him for being righteous totally, because he is not. He lets his evil nature overcome him, at least for a moment. Get your stuff together. Let's go after him. And this is part of where you see his rashness. In verses 21 and 22, Abigail is coming down the pass to meet them, and it recounts David's promise. He makes a rash vow, kind of like Jephthah does, making a vow without considering all of the implications to it. David realistically has a beef with Nabal. David's problem is with Nabal alone, and so his vow is naturally to kill every male that exists in Nabal's camp. Now, if you have there's a fun fact about that word male there in verses 30 or verse 21 and 22 especially. If I leave alive as much as one male of any who belong to him, the actual term there is not. It's not. He doesn't say man. He uses a descriptive term about using the restroom, which is slightly inappropriate to repeat in a public context. However, here on the internet, nothing is inappropriate. It's the if I leave alive any of those who urinate against the wall, is the way he puts it. In the King James, it uses even more slightly interesting language in that one verse. The point of it being, instead of saying man, he's so agitated, he's using a phrase, kind of a crude phrase, to refer to all these people, because he's not really thinking of them as people. If he was, maybe he would reconsider. I have a problem with Nabal himself, and as a result, I'm going to murder every man in his family and his friends and his coworkers, and any man who's at his house is dead meat. What in the world are we doing? Right? Where did that come from? Because suddenly David, who showed good self-control in the beginning, has turned a bit wrathful to go and kill Nabal, but now he's just kind of straight up rash and trying to murder everyone who's in Nabal's house. This has escalated ridiculously out of control. He is so caught up in the moment and in the warpath of these things that he is experiencing that he has not come back around and thought about what that actually means. He is going to kill so many of the servants who wanted to help him but couldn't because Nabal commanded them not to, and they were obeying their master. They were being righteous, and he's about to kill these people because they were righteous. I mean, what are you thinking, David? But here we are. He's so caught up in the moment, he doesn't even realize how far gone he is until Abigail comes to him. And that's the important thing. When Abigail comes and makes her appeal to him, verses 26 down through, or rather verse 23 down through verse 31, when Abigail makes her appeal to him, David takes a step back. And that's the second and the other good thing that David actually does in this passage. One of the defining aspects of a fool is someone who will not accept correction. David proves himself to be better than Nabal, better than the fool, because he is willing to listen when someone corrects him and to actually make changes. David finally, at this point, realizes God probably doesn't want him to follow through on murder. He made a vow. He made a rash vow. Don't be doing that, because now David has to break that vow and say, actually, wait a second, I should not be killing all these people. I don't know how David could make up for not following through on a vow to the Lord, but I am glad he didn't follow through on such an evil vow. He just set himself up for failure when he was so rash and made a decision to take a vow even though he shouldn't have. David does repent, and it's good, and he quits seeking to do evil to this Nabal. Nabal does die at the end of the story, but it's not because David went in and killed him. It's actually because God went in and killed him, because God said, yeah, okay, like, I spared this guy, but even so, Nabal didn't deserve to live. Even so, when Abigail told him about all these things, Nabal seems to just have like a panic attack about it, and God just puts him out of his misery 10 days later, or something. I'm unclear on exactly how verses 37 and 38 went, but it does seem that Nabal had a physical reaction, and then God ends up just putting him down at the end, just solidifying the kill and making sure Nabal passes on in the end. David actually repents. David quits seeking to do his evil. It's not with Nabal. Nabal does evil, and he never repents, and he never changes. Even when he's told, hey, your stuff is gone, he just enters into mourning about it and then dies over it. Abigail never has the struggle. Abigail never has to stop and say, hey, which one's the right thing to do? Now, maybe if we were actually there observing the real-life event instead of reading this brief summary of it, there may have been a moment where Abigail was like, well, I could just let David in and kill everybody. I have no idea. I'm not the one who... I wasn't there. I didn't see those things. We don't have that recorded. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. Also doesn't mean it did happen. Abigail just kind of does good. David is not someone who is so pure that he just does good all the time, but he is someone who is willing to reconsider what he is doing and even repent and change. And I think that's really important, because a lot of the time when we ask that question, what made David the man after God's own heart, nobody's saying it's because he was righteous all the time, because David clearly wasn't righteous all the time. There are a bunch of instances where he's doing evil things, sometimes horrifically evil things, that result in one or a bunch of people getting killed. I mean, the whole Bathsheba thing with Uriah, and then everything about that is absolutely despicable. It's not that David is just like a good person who is unimpeachable and unstained and unspotted and blameless and etc. It's not that David is so perfect, but it is that David is willing to reconsider and not dig himself a deeper grave than he's already in, at least most of the time. When Nathan the prophet does go to David and say, hey, you've done wrong, David at that point repents. At that point he's like, yeah, I have actually done wrong, and then he repents and he changes from that. He is far from perfect, but he's also willing to turn and actually seek God. When people ask me, what does it mean David is the man after God's own heart, this is usually the thing that I come back to, is David wasn't perfect, but at least he was willing to reconsider and make changes when evil was brought to his attention. He is nowhere near perfect, nowhere near what you should be. But a lot of us, if we're honest, we're a lot worse than even David is. Because a lot of us, when we get corrected, we don't want to hear that we're wrong, and we try and push back, and we try to make ourselves right, even though we are, in fact, incorrect. Do you want to be like Nabal? Probably not. Hopefully not. He's an absolutely evil human being, despicable. Do you want to be like Abigail? Hopefully and probably. That's the one that you should be aiming to. That's like the ideal, is doing everything the right way. But a lot of us find ourselves even struggling to attain the level of David, which is someone who bounces back and forth from good to evil and ultimately, hopefully, chooses good, although you may find that your mileage varies. Be careful with that. Be wise in the decisions that you make. And above all, go ahead and be like, better David than Nabal. Better Abigail than David, ultimately, at the end of the day. Choose your role models wisely. Everyone gets a proper ending in this story, and when you get to the end of the story, Nabal is struck dead by God, which I don't think anyone would say he was undeserving of Nabal to receive that. Abigail is freed from the evil man and ultimately even married and provided for by David, so that's a positive blessing ending for her. David is turned from his wickedness so that he doesn't face Nabal's own fate. He's turned from his foolishness. He accepts his fault instead of doubling down, just like Nabal did. What kind of attitudes do you see that lead to that kind of positive result? You know the bad ones, you know some good ones, you know the ones that are kind of hemming and hawing, and you know where you need to be aiming, so aim towards those things and foster those attributes. It's not that hard to hear a message that says, hey, humility and generousness and loyalty and peacemaking is better than greed and arrogance and ingratitude and unkindness and unreasonableness. It's not a surprise to hear something like that in a sermon, but it is difficult to go and turn around and actually live something like that in real life. So good luck and God bless you in your endeavors. Later on this week, I think there may be a class video. I don't remember. I don't think so this week. Nothing on Friday, and then next week we'll have the full slate of things. So I will see you at least next Monday, if not before.